I stood in the kitchen doorway, oil lamp trembling in my grip, staring at the crumpled rules I'd just smoothed across the counter. The foghorn's single blast still echoed in my ears, a sound that had come from directly above me, from the beacon room I hadn't even visited yet. 3 weeks. That's how long Mildred had been dead, and I was just now getting around to dealing with her estate. Work had kept me busy, or maybe I'd kept myself busy with work. Either way, the lighthouse had been sitting here empty while I told myself there was no rush. The property manager's note had been brief. Keys under the mat. Everything's been maintained. Good luck. I'd assumed he meant the usual estate stuff, dusty furniture, outdated appliances, maybe some paperwork to sort through. Not whatever this was. I picked up the laminated card again, reading each rule slowly. Count exactly 7 boats at dawn, regardless of how many appear. The wording bothered me more now. Why would someone need to specify, regardless of how many appear, unless there might be more than 7? And why 7 specifically? My phone sat dead on the counter next to the smoking remains of my laptop. The screen had gone black the moment I'd finished counting 8 boats, like something had reached through the glass and flipped a switch. I'd brought backup batteries, portable chargers, even a small solar panel. All of it useless now. The foghorn sounded again. 2 blasts, this time. I grabbed the oil lamp and headed for the spiral staircase, my work boots echoing against the metal steps. The lighthouse felt bigger on the inside than it had looked from the dock, each level stretching higher than seemed possible. Keeper's quarters on the first floor, storage on the second, and then the long climb to the beacon room at the top. The stairs creaked under my weight, a rhythmic groaning that almost masked the sound of my own breathing. I'd renovated plenty of old buildings, but this place felt different. Not just old, patient, like it had been waiting. At the 3rd landing, I stopped to catch my breath and check the oil lamp's flame. The wick burned steady and bright, casting dancing shadows on the curved walls. Through a small window, I could see the ocean stretching toward the horizon where I'd counted those 8 boats. 7 boats. Whatever. The foghorn blasted 3 times in quick succession. I took the remaining stairs 2 at a time, pushing through the door into the beacon room. The space was smaller than I'd expected, dominated by the massive Fresnel lens that focused the lighthouse's beam. Control panels lined the walls. Some obviously modern additions, others that looked like they belonged in a maritime museum. But no foghorn. At least nothing that looked like it could make that sound. I circled the lens housing, holding the oil lamp high to examine every surface. The foghorn had definitely come from up here, but the only equipment I could see was the beacon itself and what looked like a radio setup in the corner. I checked the radio. Dead, like everything else electronic. A brass telescope sat mounted near one of the windows. I peered through it, scanning the horizon where the boats had been. Empty ocean now, just gray water meeting gray sky. But I'd seen them. 8 distinct shapes, fishing boats or maybe pleasure craft, all heading in the same direction. The foghorn sounded once more, so close it seemed to come from inside my own head. I spun around, nearly dropping the lamp. The beacon room was empty except for me and the equipment, but something had changed. One of the control panels showed a single red light that hadn't been there before, a steady glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. I approached the panel carefully. No labels, no obvious switches, just that one red light and a series of gauges with needles pointing to positions I couldn't interpret. The light pulsed faster as I got closer, and I realized it was responding to my presence, or to the oil lamp. I held the lamp away from the panel and the pulsing slowed, brought it closer and the rhythm quickened. Whatever this system was, it was designed to work with oil lamps, not electric lights. The rules weren't just arbitrary restrictions. They were operating instructions. My hands weren't shaking anymore. The engineer in me was taking over, analyzing the problem instead of panicking about it. Mildred hadn't been losing her mind when she'd followed these rules. She'd been maintaining some kind of system, keeping something running that required very specific conditions. But what kind of system needed you to count boats wrong? I made my way back down the stairs, moving more slowly now, thinking. The lighthouse had been automated decades ago. The Coast Guard had installed modern equipment to handle navigation warnings and beacon operation. So why did it still need a keeper? Why did it need someone to follow rules that made no sense? In the keeper's quarters, I found Mildred's personal effects still scattered around the main room. Reading glasses on the kitchen table, a half-finished crossword puzzle, medications lined up on the windowsill. The property manager had cleared out the perishables, but left everything else exactly as she'd had it. I opened the refrigerator and found it empty except for a single item on the top shelf, a leather-bound journal with keeper's log embossed on the cover. The pages were filled with Mildred's careful handwriting, entries dating back 43 years. Day 1. Took over from Mother. She explained the rules but not the reasons. Said I'd understand soon enough. Day 847. Visitor came asking for directions. Gave him a map and sandwich. Generator failed immediately after. Rules exist for a reason. Day 3,2991. Counted 8 boats again by mistake. Phone lines went down for 6 hours. Must be more careful. I flipped to the most recent entries, dated just weeks before her death. Day 15,695. Getting harder to remember why the rules matter. Maybe that's a blessing. Day 15,702. Natalie called today. Wanted to visit. Told him I was fine. Didn't need help. Can't let him see this place while I still remember what it really is. Day 15,708. Forgot to log yesterday. Woke up to find all the windows cracked. Fixed them before dawn. Close call. The final entry was dated the day before she'd been found unconscious in town. The day before the dementia diagnosis that had led to her death in the care facility. Day 15,710. Can feel my mind going. Maybe it's time. Better to forget than to know. Better to be crazy than to be the one who has to count the boats. I closed the journal and set it on the counter next to the rules. Outside, the fog was rolling in from the ocean, thick gray walls that would make counting anything impossible by morning. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight I had to figure out what I'd inherited besides a lighthouse and a bunch of nonsense rules. I had to figure out what Mildred had been protecting me from, and why she'd chosen madness over whatever truth she'd been carrying for 43 years. The oil lamp flickered, and I realized I'd been standing in the kitchen for over an hour, reading by its light. My eyes had adjusted completely to the warm glow, and the idea of electric lights seemed harsh and unnecessary. I picked up a pen and opened the keeper's log to a fresh page. Day 1. Arrived to settle estate. Rules seem connected to lighthouse systems. All electronic devices failed after counting 8 boats instead of 7. Need to understand what Mildred was really doing here. I checked my watch, 11:47 p.m. 13 minutes until midnight, and the rules said everything had to be logged before then. I'd made the entry with time to spare, though I wasn't sure why that mattered. At exactly midnight, the oil lamp's flame jumped higher for just a moment, as if something had breathed life into it. Then it settled back to its steady glow, and I heard the foghorn sound once more from the beacon room above. One blast, like an acknowledgement. I looked down at my handwriting in the keeper's log and realized I'd just written my first official entry, not as Natalie Strickland settling an estate, but as the lighthouse keeper recording the day's events. The rules were still crumpled on the counter where I'd smoothed them out. I picked up the laminated card and read through them one more time, no longer seeing arbitrary restrictions but operational requirements for a system I didn't understand yet. Tomorrow I'd count 7 boats, no matter how many appeared on the horizon. Tonight I'd sleep in Mildred's bed and try to figure out what I'd gotten myself into. The oil lamp burned steady and bright, the only light I'd need. The 3 knocks came at sunset, sharp and deliberate against the lighthouse's heavy front door. I'd been sitting in the kitchen, working my way through more of Mildred's journal entries by oil lamp light, when the sound cut through the evening quiet. I opened the door to find a young woman standing on the porch, maybe late 20s, wearing a yellow rain slicker that looked vintage, the kind of thing you'd find in a maritime museum. Her pale hair caught the last rays of sunlight, and she had the kind of ageless face that made it hard to pin down exactly when she might have been born. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. "I'm Kayla Olson. I was wondering if I could trouble you for some water and crackers, nothing more." Water and crackers. Such a specific, modest request. I glanced past her toward the dock, but didn't see a boat. The evening was clear, no sign of the rain her slicker suggested she'd been expecting. "Of course," I said, stepping back. "But you must be hungry for more than crackers. I've got soup heating up and there's plenty. Why don't you come in?" Something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe concern. "That's very kind, but water and crackers would be perfect." I thought about the rules crumpled on my kitchen counter. Provide water and crackers to any visitor who requests them. Nothing more. But hospitality mattered more than arbitrary restrictions, especially when someone had made the effort to reach this isolated place. "I insist," I said, opening the door wider. "There's a guest room upstairs if you need somewhere to stay the night. I can get you some blankets, maybe find you some dry clothes." Kayla hesitated at the threshold. "Are you certain? Sometimes kindness can have unexpected consequences." "I'm certain." She stepped inside, and the moment her foot crossed the doorway, the world exploded. The backup generator in the shed detonated with enough force to rattle every window in the lighthouse. Through the kitchen window, I watched the shed door blow clean off its hinges, spinning through the air before crashing into the rocks below. Orange flames licked at the evening sky where my emergency power supply had been. "What the hell?" I started, but when I turned back to Kayla, the words died in my throat. She was looking toward the burning shed, and in the oil lamp's flickering light, her eyes caught the flame like a night animal's. Green light reflected back at me, too bright, too steady. Not the normal shine of human eyes in lamplight, but something else entirely. "The rules exist for reasons beyond human understanding," she said, still watching the fire. "Your grandmother kept them perfectly for 43 years until dementia freed her from the burden of knowing." The foghorn sounded from above, 3 long, mournful blasts that seemed to shake the lighthouse's foundation. I grabbed the battery-powered lantern I'd left on the counter, determined to check the beacon room and figure out where that sound was coming from. The rules said to use only oil lamps after sunset, but I was done following arbitrary restrictions that made no sense. The moment my fingers touched the lantern's plastic casing, it crumbled. Not broke, crumbled like it had been rusting for decades. Metal components turned to orange powder in my hands, and the plastic housing dissolved into brittle fragments that scattered across the kitchen floor. Kayla turned those 2 bright eyes on me. Some rules protect the rule maker as much as they protect everything else. I picked up an oil lamp with shaking hands and headed for the spiral staircase. Behind me, I heard Kayla's footsteps following, but when I glanced back, she was gone. The kitchen stood empty except for the scattered remains of my lantern. The beacon room was dark when I reached it, the massive lens housing silent and still. But wet footprints marked the floor, small, precise prints that led from the lamp housing to the exterior door. I followed them onto the gallery that circled the beacon room, holding my oil lamp high. The footprints continued along the narrow walkway, clearly visible in the lamp's glow. I swept the light in slow circles, searching for any sign of Kayla, but the gallery was empty. The ocean stretched out 500 feet below, gray water meeting darker sky. I followed the wet prints to the railing's edge, where they simply stopped. No sign of a struggle, no indication she'd climbed over. The prints just ended, as if she'd stepped off the gallery and into empty air. but there were drops of seawater marking the path, still wet, still glistening in the lamplight. I leaned over the railing, sweeping the lamp back and forth, but saw nothing except rocks and surf far below. No body, no splash, no disturbance in the water. Kayla Olson had simply vanished between one sweep of my lamp and the next. Back in the keeper's office, I pulled logbooks from the shelf with growing urgency. If Mildred had been keeping records for 43 years, maybe she'd encountered something like this before. Maybe there was an explanation that didn't require me to believe I'd just watched someone disappear into thin air. I found what I was looking for in a leather-bound journal dated 1952. The handwriting was different, younger, more confident than Mildred's later entries. But the name at the top of the page made my blood run cold. Day 12. Kayla Olson came to the door at sunset, asking for water and crackers. Offered her a meal and shelter instead. Generator exploded the moment she crossed the threshold. Found her footprints on the gallery leading to the railing's edge. But she was gone. Seawater drops marked the path, though the ocean is 500 feet down. Note: follow the rules exactly. Kindness has consequences here. I read the entry 3 times, checking the date. 1952, 70 years ago. But the woman I just met couldn't have been older than 30, and the description matched perfectly, down to the yellow rain slicker and the specific request for water and crackers. I flipped through more pages, looking for additional mentions of Kayla Olson, but found nothing. Just that single entry, written in careful script by someone who'd learned the same lesson I was learning now. The oil lamp flickered, and I realized my hands were shaking again. Not from fear this time, but from the growing certainty that I'd inherited something far more complex than a lighthouse and a set of arbitrary rules. Outside, the foghorn sounded once more, a single, long blast that seemed to acknowledge my understanding. I opened the current keeper's log and picked up my pen. Day 2. Visitor came asking for water and crackers, offered more despite the rules. Generator destroyed immediately. Visitor disappeared from gallery, leaving only wet footprints that ended at the railing. Found identical incident recorded in 1952 logbook. Same woman, same request, same outcome. Beginning to understand that the rules aren't suggestions. I checked my watch, 11:58 p.m., 2 minutes to spare. At midnight, the oil lamp's flame jumped higher, and I heard footsteps on the gallery above. Slow, measured steps that circled the beacon room once before fading into silence. I didn't go up to investigate. Some lessons I was learning only needed to be taught once. The knocking started at exactly 3 a.m. I'd been lying in Mildred's bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the foghorn's irregular blasts when the sound began. Not from the front door this time, from directly beneath me. Steady, deliberate raps against wood, like someone trapped under the floorboards was asking to be let out. I grabbed an oil lamp and followed the sound to the kitchen, where it grew louder. The knocking seemed to come from the area near the pantry where I'd noticed a door I'd assumed led to a storage closet. But looking at it now, I realized it was positioned wrong for storage. The door sat flush with the floor, secured with a heavy padlock that looked decades old. A basement door. And the rules said never to open it. The knocking intensified when I stood directly over the door, like whatever was down there could sense my presence. 3 sharp raps, pause, 3 more raps, over and over with mechanical precision. I'd spent 2 days following rules that made no sense, watching my electronics fail and my generator explode, meeting visitors who vanished into thin air. I was done being the obedient keeper who asked no questions. The crowbar was in Mildred's toolbox, right where any practical person would keep it. The padlock was old but solid, requiring 3 hard strikes before the metal gave way with a sharp crack. The door swung open on well-oiled hinges, revealing wooden stairs that descended into darkness, so complete it seemed to swallow light. I held the oil lamp high and started down. The flame flickered but held steady, casting dancing shadows on rough stone walls. The basement was larger than the lighthouse's footprint should have allowed, stretching back into darkness that my lamp couldn't penetrate. But I could see enough. A woman sat at a desk in the middle of the space, her back to the stairs. Dark hair fell past her shoulders and she wore a denim jacket over a burgundy sweater. Dust covered everything. The desk, the chair, her clothes, like she'd been sitting there for decades. But when she turned to face me, her eyes were bright and alert. "You must be Natalie," she said, brushing dust from her sleeve. "I'm Samantha Maldonado. I've been waiting for you to come down here." I nearly dropped the lamp. "How long have you been down here?" "Since 1987 or maybe 2003. Time gets a bit mixed up down here." She gestured to the journal open on her desk. "I came looking for my uncle. He disappeared from a fishing boat near here, and I thought the lighthouse keeper might have seen something." The journal's pages were filled with handwriting in different inks. Some entries faded with age, while others looked fresh. I could see dates scattered across the open pages. 1987, 1995, 2015, 2023. Some dates that hadn't happened yet. "That's impossible," I said. "You can't have been down here for 36 years. You'd be..." "Dead?" "Yeah, I should be." Samantha stood up, dust falling from her clothes like snow. "But this place doesn't follow normal rules about time. I've been living the same month over and over, just in different years. Sometimes I'm 28, sometimes I'm 45. Right now I feel about 31, but I stopped keeping track." She picked up the journal and flipped through pages covered in her own handwriting. "Look at this. Entry from 1987 when I first got trapped. Entry from 2003 when your mother was keeping the lighthouse. Entry from last week when you arrived, though I wrote it 3 years ago." The basement felt colder suddenly, and my oil lamp's flame wavered. "What is this place?" "Dimensional crossroads. The lighthouse sits right on top of a weak spot where realities bleed through. Time gets all twisted up, and people like us get caught in the overflow." Samantha closed the journal and looked at me with eyes that held too much knowledge. "Your family's been keeping watch for generations, making sure nothing too dangerous slips through." A boat horn sounded from outside, cutting through the basement's oppressive quiet. I'd heard that horn before. Sean's supply boat. "He's early," Samantha said, checking a watch that showed 3 different times on 3 different faces. Or late. Hard to tell anymore. I climbed back up to the kitchen, leaving Samantha in her dusty basement office. Through the window, I could see Sean's boat pulling up to the dock, the same cheerful delivery man who'd brought supplies 2 days ago. "Sorry I'm late," Sean called out as I met him at the dock. "Had some trouble with the engine. 3 days behind schedule." But he'd been here 2 days ago. I'd signed for his delivery, watched him unload boxes of canned goods and lamp oil. Now he was apologizing for being late with the same delivery. "You were already here," I said. "Tuesday morning. You brought supplies then." Sean's face went blank for a moment, like he was trying to access a memory that wouldn't come. "Tuesday? No, that's not right. Today's my first delivery this month." He handed me a clipboard with delivery forms already filled out. My signature was at the bottom of each page, though I hadn't signed anything yet. The handwriting was definitely mine, but the dates were wrong. Some showed next week, others showed deliveries from months in the future. "How long have you been making deliveries here?" I asked, signing forms that already had my signature. "Since..." Sean paused, his expression shifting. For just a moment, his face looked older, lines around his eyes, gray in his hair. Then it snapped back to his usual 30-something appearance. "Since I started the business. Family tradition, you know. My father delivered here, and his father before him." But the delivery log in his truck showed entries going back to 1962, all signed by different keepers. My mother's name appeared dozens of times between 1995 and 2010. Mildred's signature covered pages from the 1950s through the 1990s. Names I didn't recognize filled the earlier entries. Other family members, other keepers who'd maintained this place across decades. "Sean," I said carefully, "what year do you think it is?" His face flickered again, cycling through different ages like a television changing channels. Young Sean, middle-aged Sean, elderly Sean, back to young Sean. It's hard to remember. The lighthouse has always needed supplies. I've always brought them. He unloaded boxes with practiced efficiency, stacking them on the dock like he'd done this exact delivery hundreds of times, which I was beginning to realize he probably had. In the kitchen, I opened the first box and found newspapers dated next week. The headlines made my blood run cold. "Local man missing from lighthouse property" and "Search continues for missing engineer." My own photo stared back at me from the front page, along with quotes from coworkers who said I'd been acting strangely before disappearing. The second box held newspapers from different dates, some from last month, others from years in the future. All of them carried variations of the same story. Different keepers, different decades, but always the same pattern. Someone inherits the lighthouse, someone goes missing, someone new takes their place. I found Samantha back in the basement, writing in her journal by the light of an oil lamp that cast no shadows. "The newspapers," I said, "they show me disappearing." "Time isn't linear here," she said without looking up. "Past, present, and future all exist at once. The newspapers are just reporting what's already happened from the lighthouse's perspective. But I'm still here. Are you?" She turned to face me, and in the lamplight, her face looked exactly as it had in 1987, young, determined, alive. "Or are you just experiencing the memory of being here? Sometimes I can't tell the difference anymore." The boat horn sounded again, and through the basement's small window, I could see Sean's boat pulling away from the dock. But I could also see it approaching and sitting tied up, all at the same time. 3 different versions of the same moment, overlapping like double-exposed photographs. "How do I get out?" I asked. Samantha smiled sadly and returned to her journal. "You don't. None of us do. We just keep the lighthouse running, keep the barriers stable, keep the dimensions from bleeding into each other too much. It's what your family's always done." She was right. I could feel it in my bones, in the way the oil lamp's flame responded to my presence, in the way the lighthouse itself seemed to breathe around me. This wasn't just a building I'd inherited. It was a responsibility that had been passed down through generations, a duty that transcended normal human understanding. But knowing that didn't make it easier to accept. I climbed back to the kitchen and opened the keeper's log to a fresh page. Day 3. Found Samantha Maldonado in basement, trapped since 1987 in temporal loop. Sean Warner has been making deliveries since 1962, aging and not aging simultaneously. Newspapers show my disappearance as already reported. Beginning to understand that time works differently here, that the lighthouse exists across multiple timelines at once. I checked my watch, 11:55 p.m., 5 minutes to spare. At midnight, the oil lamp's flame jumped higher, and I heard Samantha's voice drifting up from the basement, reading aloud from her journal. But the words she spoke were entries I hadn't heard her write, describing events that hadn't happened yet. Or maybe they had. In this place, it was getting harder to tell the difference. I climbed the spiral stairs to the beacon room, bucket of soapy water sloshing against my leg with each step. Day 4. An even-numbered day, which meant window cleaning according to the rules. I'd been putting it off since dawn, telling myself it was pointless busy work, but the oil lamps had started flickering whenever I walked past the laminated card on the kitchen counter. The beacon room's curved windows hadn't been cleaned in months, maybe longer. Salt spray and weather had left them clouded with grime that filtered the afternoon light into a dim, greenish glow. I dipped the rag in the bucket and started with the eastward-facing pane, working in slow circles to cut through the accumulated dirt. My reflection appeared gradually as the glass cleared. Dark hair, wire-rimmed glasses, the same angular face I'd been seeing in mirrors for 34 years. But as I continued cleaning, something was wrong with the image staring back at me. The reflection looked older, much older, with deep lines around the eyes and silver threading through hair that had gone completely gray. I stopped scrubbing and leaned closer to the glass. The elderly version of myself was moving independently now, not mirroring my actions. His mouth opened and closed in a steady rhythm, forming the same words over and over. Don't resist. Don't resist. Don't resist. I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over the water bucket. When I looked again, my reflection was normal, 34 years old, confused, holding a cleaning rag like it might bite me. The brass telescope sat mounted near the window. I grabbed it and swung it hard against the glass. The window exploded into dozens of pieces, each shard catching the afternoon light as it fell. But instead of hitting the floor, the fragments hung suspended in the air, spinning slowly like a mobile made of broken mirrors. Each piece showed a different version of myself. Child Natalie, maybe 8 years old, pressed his small hands against the glass from the inside, his mouth open in a silent scream. Teenage Natalie pounded his fists against his shard, his face twisted with the same stubborn anger I remembered from those years. Middle-aged Natalie sat slumped in his piece, head in his hands, looking defeated. Ancient Natalie, older than the reflection I'd seen moments before, stared out with eyes that held too much knowledge, his lips still forming those same words. Don't resist. All of them were trapped inside their individual shards, beating against the glass, trying to break through to where I stood watching. The fragments began moving toward each other, drawn by some invisible force. They clicked together like puzzle pieces, reforming the original window pane with perfect precision. The different versions of myself merged back into a single reflection. My current self, 34 and terrified, staring at a window that showed no sign of ever being broken, but I could still see them in my peripheral vision. All those other versions of myself moving independently behind the glass. Heavy banging erupted from the guest room below, so violent it shook the beacon room floor. I'd locked that door from the outside after finding it standing open yesterday morning. The room was empty. I'd checked it twice. The banging intensified, like someone throwing their full weight against the door over and over, but mixed with the impacts came another sound. Scratching. Long, deliberate scrapes against wood, as if something with claws was trying to tear its way through. I grabbed an oil lamp and headed downstairs. The guest room door was still locked, the old-fashioned key exactly where I'd left it in the keyhole, but the wood around the lock was splintering, fresh gouges appearing in the painted surface as I watched. The scratching sounds were coming from inside the walls now, moving through the lighthouse's structure like something large was clawing its way between the floors. The sound traveled from the guest room toward the kitchen, then up toward the beacon room, then back down again in an endless circuit. I pressed my ear to the guest room door. Silence. Then a single soft knock from directly on the other side, right where my head touched the wood. I jerked back and unlocked the door, throwing it open. The room was empty. Bed made, curtains drawn, everything exactly as I'd left it. But the window was open, salt air flowing through the gap, and wet footprints marked the floor. The same small, precise prints I'd found on the beacon room gallery after Kayla disappeared. The beacon room door was bulging inward when I returned upstairs, the heavy wood groaning under enormous pressure. Something was pushing against it from the gallery outside, but when I looked through the windows, I could see the entire walkway. Nothing there except empty space and ocean wind. The door bulged further, wood fibers stretching and splitting. Fresh claw marks appeared on the surface, getting deeper in real time as I watched. 4 parallel gouges, then another set, then another, like invisible claws, were methodically shredding the door from the outside. I backed away from the door and nearly tripped over the water bucket. The cleaning rag floated on the surface, and in the soapy water, I could see reflections that didn't match the room around me. Different furniture, different walls, different decades. The water showed the beacon room as it had been in the past, and in each reflection, a different keeper stood exactly where I was standing, watching their own version of the door being destroyed by something they couldn't see. In the keeper's office, I pulled books from the shelves with shaking hands, looking for anything that might explain what was happening. Most of the logbooks covered routine maintenance and weather observations, but behind the 1952 journal, my fingers found a gap in the shelf, a hidden compartment just large enough for a single book. The journal inside was bound in dark leather, newer than the others. The name on the cover made my breath catch. Margaret Strickland, lighthouse keeper. My mother's name, my mother's handwriting. I opened to the first entry, dated 1995. Day 1. Took over from Mother after her first breakdown. She's in the care facility now. Doesn't remember the lighthouse or the rules. Maybe that's a mercy. Natalie thinks I died in a car accident. Better he believes that than know what I'm really doing here. I flipped through pages filled with familiar observations. Boat counts, visitor encounters, equipment failures. But these entries carried a weight that Mildred's had lacked, a growing understanding of what the lighthouse really was. Day 847. The convergence is getting stronger. Counted 12 boats this morning, but logged 7 as required. The extra 5 were wrong somehow. Too long, too narrow, filled with shapes that weren't quite human. The rules aren't arbitrary. They're minimum requirements to keep realities separate. Day 1 to 203. Natalie called the care facility looking for me. Told them to say I was too sick for visitors. He can't know I'm alive. He can't know about this place. 1 keeper per generation is enough sacrifice. Day 2 on 156. Found Mother's research hidden in the basement walls. The lighthouse sits on a dimensional weak point that's been growing unstable for decades. Each keeper's job is to maintain the barriers, keep the wrong things from crossing over. The rules work, but they're not enough anymore. Something bigger is coming. The final entry was dated the day before her supposed death. Day 2847. I understand now why Mother chose madness. It's the only escape from knowing what we're holding back. But madness means abandoning the post, and abandoning the post means the convergence happens anyway. There has to be another way. There has to be someone who can handle the truth without breaking. Natalie has his father's practical mind and his grandfather's stubborn streak. Maybe that's enough. Maybe he can find a solution I couldn't see. I closed the journal and sat in the growing darkness, oil lamp casting dancing shadows on the walls. My mother hadn't died in a car accident. She'd been here, in this room, following these same rules, protecting me from a truth I was only now beginning to understand. The scratching in the walls had stopped. The beacon room door was no longer bulging. But in the sudden quiet, I could hear something else. Footsteps on the gallery above, slow and measured, circling the beacon room like someone was pacing. I climbed the stairs and peered through the beacon room windows. The gallery was empty, but wet footprints marked the walkway, and they were still appearing, one after another, as if invisible feet were walking the circuit. In the curved glass, my reflection showed all the versions of myself again: child, teenager, adult, elderly, all moving independently, all mouthing the same words. Don't resist. But now I could see what they were really saying, reading their lips in the lamplight. Don't resist the truth. I opened the keeper's log and picked up my pen. Day 4. Cleaned windows as required. Reflections showed multiple versions of myself trapped in the glass. Guest room disturbances continue despite locked door. Found mother's journal hidden in office. She didn't die in 1995. She was keeping the lighthouse. Entries describe something called the convergence and dimensional barriers that require constant maintenance. Beginning to understand that the rules aren't restrictions but minimum requirements to prevent reality collapse. I checked my watch. 11:59 p.m. 1 minute to spare. At midnight, the oil lamp's flame jumped higher, and I heard my mother's voice drifting down from the beacon room, reading aloud from her journal. But the words she spoke were entries I hadn't found yet, describing events that were still to come. The footsteps on the gallery continued their endless circuit, and in the window's reflection, all versions of myself nodded in unison, finally understanding what they'd been trying to tell me. I set the pen down at 11:47 and walked away from the keeper's log. 4 days of following arbitrary rules, 4 days of watching my electronics fail and my sanity slip away piece by piece. 4 days of discovering that my entire family had been lying to me about everything that mattered. I was done being the obedient keeper who asked no questions and followed instructions that made no sense. The oil lamp flickered on the kitchen counter, its flame dancing like it was trying to get my attention. 13 minutes until midnight. 13 minutes until I was supposed to record the day's events and maintain whatever system my family had been feeding for generations. I walked to the living room instead and sat in Mildred's old armchair, crossing my arms and watching the clock on the mantel tick toward midnight. Let the rules go unmet for once. Let whatever consequences come. I was tired of being controlled by laminated cards and family secrets. 11:58. The oil lamp's flame stretched higher, reaching toward the ceiling like a desperate hand. 11:59. The lighthouse itself seemed to hold its breath, the constant background creaking of old wood falling silent. Midnight. Every light source in the lighthouse died at exactly the same moment. Not just the oil lamps, everything. The candles I'd lit in the bedroom, the emergency lantern I'd left on the kitchen counter, even the moonlight streaming through the windows simply vanished, as if someone had thrown a switch that controlled illumination itself. The darkness wasn't just the absence of light, it was presence, thick and suffocating, pressing against my skin like cold water. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face, couldn't see the chair I was sitting in or the walls around me. The lighthouse had become a void, empty space that swallowed everything, including the concept of sight. But I could see the shadows. They moved across the walls like living things, darker patches against the absolute blackness. Impossible shadows with no light source to cast them, flowing and shifting in patterns that suggested human shapes. A woman in a long dress moved past the kitchen doorway, her shadow form carrying what looked like an oil lamp that cast no glow. A man climbed the spiral staircase, his shadow feet making no sound on the metal steps. More shadows appeared, dozens of them, all moving with purpose through the lighthouse. They went about their business like they'd been doing it for decades, checking windows, adjusting equipment, writing in journals that existed only in shadow. Previous keepers, I realized, still maintaining their duties in whatever timeline they'd been trapped in. You can't fight what you don't understand. My mother's voice drifted through the darkness, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. And you can't understand until you accept. I tried to stand up, but the chair seemed to hold me in place, not physically. I could move my arms and legs freely, but every time I tried to rise, I found myself still sitting, like the action of standing had been erased from possibility. "Mom?" The word came out as a whisper. "Mildred lied about my death to protect you from coming here too soon." Her voice was exactly as I remembered it, warm and patient, the tone she'd used when explaining why I couldn't have a dog, or why I had to finish my homework before playing outside. "She knew you'd try to find me if you thought I was alive. She knew you'd end up here eventually anyway. It's what our family does. but she wanted to give you as much normal life as possible first. The shadow woman in the kitchen turned toward me, and though I couldn't see her face, I knew it was my mother. She raised her shadow hand in a small wave, the same gesture she'd used when dropping me off at school. I took her place when her mind started breaking. She continued. 43 years of maintaining the barrier, of knowing what waits beyond it. That's too much for anyone to carry. She was starting to make mistakes, forgetting rules, letting things slip through. So I stepped in. You could have told me. My voice cracked like a teenager's. You could have explained instead of letting me think you were dead. Would you have believed me? Would you have accepted that your mother was trapped in a lighthouse, following nonsense rules to keep reality stable? Or would you have tried to rescue me, tried to fix everything with your engineer's mind and your stubborn certainty that every problem has a logical solution? She was right. I would have tried to fix it. I would have brought equipment and backup power and rational explanations, just like I'd tried to do these past 4 days. I would have made everything worse. Light blazed suddenly from the beacon room above, the massive lens housing spinning to life without anyone touching the controls. The beam swept across the ocean in its regular pattern, but instead of empty water, it illuminated 7 boats sitting motionless on the horizon. 7 boats, exactly as the rules required me to count each dawn. But dawn was hours away, and these boats had appeared in the middle of the night, drawn by my failure to maintain the log. I could see them clearly in the beacon's sweeping light. Old fishing vessels, maybe 40 feet long, sitting dead in the water without running lights or any sign of engines. But they weren't empty. Tall figures stood on each deck, perfectly still, their faces turned toward the lighthouse. The figures were wrong. Too tall, too thin, with joints in their arms and legs that bent in directions human joints shouldn't bend. They stood without moving, without swaying with the ocean's motion, like statues carved from shadow and given just enough substance to exist in the physical world. What are they? I asked the darkness. What waits beyond? My mother's voice replied. What's been waiting for decades for someone to weaken the barrier enough to let them through? The beacon's light swept past the boats again, and this time I could see more details. The figures' faces were smooth and featureless, like unfinished sculptures. Their arms hung at their sides, but their hands had too many fingers, each one ending in points that might have been claws or might have been something worse. In the basement, I heard papers rustling. Samantha's voice drifted up through the floorboards, reading aloud from what sounded like a different journal entirely. The lighthouse serves as a dimensional lock, she read, her words carrying clearly through the darkness. Built on a weak point where realities intersect, maintained by human consciousness, focused through specific rituals. The rules aren't arbitrary. They're minimum requirements to keep the barriers stable, to prevent what waits in adjacent dimensions from crossing into ours. More rustling, pages turning. Each keeper eventually realizes they're not protecting ships from rocks. They're protecting reality from what wants to replace it. The things that wait beyond don't understand human concepts like death or time or individual existence. They see our reality as a flaw to be corrected, a mistake to be erased and rebuilt, according to their own incomprehensible logic. The figures on the boats raised their arms in unison, a slow, deliberate movement that sent ice through my veins. They weren't waving. They were pointing, all of them, every impossible finger aimed directly at the lighthouse, at me. The boats began moving toward shore, cutting through the water without wind or engine power. They moved in perfect formation, maintaining exact distances from each other, their progress steady and inevitable. The log entry, I whispered, understanding flooding through me like cold water. Skipping it weakened the barrier. Every rule matters, my mother confirmed. Every ritual, every restriction, every seemingly pointless requirement. They're not controlling you. They're channeling your consciousness into maintaining something that keeps two realities from colliding. I tried to stand again, and this time the chair released me. I stumbled through the darkness toward the kitchen, guided by the shadow forms of previous keepers who stepped aside to let me pass. The keeper's log lay open on the counter, my pen exactly where I'd left it. But when I picked up the pen, I could see that the page wasn't blank anymore. Words had appeared in my own handwriting, though I hadn't written them. Day 5. Refused to make midnight entry and final act of rebellion. All light sources failed at midnight, revealing shadow forms of previous keepers still maintaining duties in their temporal loops. Mother's voice confirmed she took Mildred's place to prevent reality collapse. 7 boats appeared on horizon hours before dawn, carrying entities that wait beyond dimensional barrier. Beacon activated automatically to illuminate approaching threat. Understanding now that lighthouse serves as dimensional lock, with rules being minimum requirements to prevent reality intersection. Skipping log entry weakened barrier enough to allow approach. Must restore. The entry cut off mid-sentence, the pen frozen in my hand. Through the beacon room windows I could see the boats were halfway to shore now, their impossible passengers still pointing toward the lighthouse with too many fingers. I had to finish the entry, had to complete the ritual that would strengthen the barrier and send them back to whatever dimension they'd crawled out of. But my hand wouldn't move. The pen locked in place like the words themselves were fighting against being written. The boats drew closer, and in the beacon's sweeping light I could see that the figures weren't just pointing anymore. They were beginning to change, their smooth faces developing features that hurt to look at directly. Eyes that opened in wrong places, mouths that stretched too wide, expressions that conveyed emotions no human had ever felt. My mother's shadow moved beside me, her hand covering mine on the pen. "Together," she whispered. The pen began to move, guided by both our hands, finishing the entry that would hold the barrier for another day. Barrier immediately. Rules exist to protect reality itself. We'll maintain all requirements going forward. The moment I finished writing, the boats stopped moving. The figures lowered their arms and turned away from the lighthouse, their faces smoothing back into featureless masks. One by one, the vessels faded from view, returning to whatever space between dimensions they'd emerged from. Light returned gradually. Oil lamps flickering back to life, moonlight streaming through windows, candles resuming their steady glow. The shadow forms of previous keepers faded into normal darkness, though I could still sense their presence, still feel them moving through the lighthouse in their endless routines. I checked my watch, 12:47 a.m. The entry was complete with 47 minutes to spare, just as it had been every night since I'd arrived. My mother's voice came one last time, fainter now, already fading back into whatever timeline she maintained. The rules aren't a prison, Natalie. They're a responsibility. And now you understand why it has to be you. The lighthouse settled back into its normal rhythms, creaking wood, distant foghorn, the steady sweep of the beacon across empty ocean. But I knew the ocean wasn't really empty. I knew what waited beyond the horizon, patient and eternal, ready to cross over the moment someone failed to maintain the barriers that kept reality separate. I closed the keeper's log and picked up the oil lamp, carrying it with me as I climbed the stairs to check the beacon room. Everything was functioning normally, the massive lens housing rotating on schedule, the beam sweeping across water that showed no sign of the boats that had been there minutes before. But I could feel them out there, waiting. And I understood now that they would always be waiting, that every midnight entry and dawn boat count and visitor restriction was another day of holding them back, another day of keeping our reality intact. The rules weren't arbitrary. They were the minimum requirements for existence itself, and I was the one responsible for following them. The full moon hung like a spotlight over the lighthouse, casting everything in silver relief. I'd been watching it rise from the beacon room window, counting down the hours until what Samantha called the transformation deadline. 7 nights. That's how long new keepers had to either accept their role or watch reality collapse at this intersection point. I wasn't going to let it happen. Sean's boat sat at the dock where he'd left it after his latest delivery, the keys still dangling from the ignition like he'd known I'd need them. The engine turned over on the first try, a steady rumble that cut through the night's silence. I cast off the mooring lines and pushed away from the dock, pointing the bow toward the open ocean. The lighthouse beam swept over me as I cleared the harbor, and for a moment I felt like I was escaping a prison searchlight. The rules, the temporal loops, the impossible visitors, all of it fell away behind me as the boat picked up speed. I had my engineering degree, my practical mind, my stubborn refusal to accept that some problems couldn't be solved. I'd find help on the mainland, bring back experts, figure out a way to shut down whatever dimensional nonsense was happening here. The GPS showed me heading due east, away from the lighthouse and toward the shipping lanes where I could flag down a passing vessel. But when I checked it again 10 minutes later, the display showed I was heading west, back toward shore. I spun the wheel hard to port, watching the compass needle swing to confirm my new heading. Due south now, parallel to the coastline. But the lighthouse beam kept sweeping over me from the same angle, and when I looked back, the building was exactly the same distance away as when I'd started. The GPS flickered and died. The compass needle spun wildly before settling on a heading that pointed directly at the lighthouse no matter which way I turned the wheel. I gunned the engine, pushing the boat to its maximum speed. The wake churned white behind me, and the speedometer showed 15 knots, but the lighthouse never grew smaller. If anything, it seemed to be getting closer, its beam growing brighter with each sweep. 20 minutes later, I found myself pulling up to the same dock I'd left from. The mooring lines were exactly where I'd dropped them, still coiled on the wooden planks like I'd never untied them at all. I tried again, this time heading north along the coast. Same result. The boat moved through the water. The engine ran perfectly, but space itself seemed to fold around me, bringing me back to the lighthouse dock no matter which direction I chose. On the third attempt, I wasn't alone. Kayla stood on the deck behind me, her yellow rain slicker bright in the moonlight. She hadn't been there when I'd cast off, but now she was leaning against the cabin like she'd been riding along the entire time. "It doesn't work," she said, her voice carrying that same patient sadness I'd heard during her first visit. "The lighthouse won't let you leave once you understand what it really is." I cut the engine and let the boat drift. "You're the one from 1952, the keeper who tried to run. I was 19 when I took the job. Thought it would be romantic, living alone with the sea and the stars." She moved to the bow and sat down, her feet dangling over the water. "I lasted 6 days before I tried to escape. Made it 3 miles offshore before the boat turned around by itself." The lighthouse beam swept over us again, and in its light, Kayla looked exactly as she had during her first visit. Young, translucent, caught between dimensions. But now I could see the weight she carried, the knowledge that had been accumulating for 70 years. "What happened to you?" "I exist across all timelines at once now. Every era, every keeper, every moment the lighthouse has existed." She gestured toward the building that loomed over us. "I'm there in 1952, maintaining the beacon. I'm there in 1987 when Samantha gets trapped. I'm there in 1995 when your mother takes over. I'm here now with you, and I'll be there when the next keeper arrives." Footsteps echoed from below deck, and Samantha emerged from the cabin. But she'd been in the basement when I'd left the lighthouse, writing in her journal by oil lamp light. Now she was here, wearing the same denim jacket and burgundy sweater, carrying a different notebook. "Every keeper becomes trapped in their own temporal loop," she said, settling beside Kayla on the bow. "We maintain the lighthouse in our respective timelines while new keepers arrive in others. It's the only way to keep the barriers stable across all dimensions simultaneously." I looked between them. Kayla from 1952, Samantha from 1987, both existing in the same moment on a boat that couldn't escape the lighthouse's influence. My mother, is she... She took Mildred's place in another timeline, Kayla confirmed. Just as Mildred took her own mother's place and her mother took her grandmother's place, each generation sacrificing themselves to maintain the barrier, each one hoping the next might find a better solution. The boat had drifted back to the dock while we talked, the hull bumping gently against the wooden pilings. I hadn't touched the wheel or started the engine, but we were exactly where we'd begun, mooring lines within easy reach. There has to be another way, I said. Some solution that doesn't require trapping people in temporal loops. Samantha opened her notebook and showed me pages covered in equations and diagrams. I've been working on it for 36 years, across multiple timelines. The dimensional weak point is growing stronger, requiring more energy to maintain the barriers. Eventually, even trapped keepers won't be enough. But not today, Kayla added. Today, you have to choose. Accept the role and join us in maintaining the lighthouse across time, or refuse and watch reality collapse at this intersection point. The full moon reached its zenith as I tied the boat to the dock, its light turning the ocean silver. I could feel the lighthouse waiting behind me, patient and eternal, ready to welcome another keeper into its temporal embrace. In the keeper's office, I sat down at the desk and opened the log to a fresh page. The pen felt heavier than usual, weighted with the knowledge of what I was about to write. Day 7. Attempted to escape by boat 3 times. Space folded to prevent departure, returning me to Lighthouse Dock regardless of direction traveled. Kayla Olson confirmed as 1952 keeper who now exists across all timelines simultaneously. Samantha Maldonado explained that each keeper becomes trapped in temporal loop, maintaining Lighthouse in their respective era while new keepers arrive in others. Mother took Mildred's place in another timeline, continuing family tradition of sacrifice to maintain dimensional barriers, understanding now that escape is impossible once transformation deadline is reached. Accept role as lighthouse keeper and guardian of dimensional barriers. Will maintain all rules and requirements to prevent reality collapse. As I finished writing, my handwriting began appearing in other journals scattered across the desk. Logbooks from different decades, all showing the same entry in the same moment. My acceptance was being recorded across multiple timelines simultaneously, binding me to the lighthouse in every era it existed. A new laminated card appeared beside the others, this one showing rules I'd never seen before. At the bottom, in small print, it read, "Compiled by Natalie Strickland, Lighthouse Keeper." But I hadn't written these rules. Not yet. The next morning I stood in the beacon room watching the horizon as dawn broke over the ocean. 8 boats sat motionless on the water, but I counted only 7, understanding now that acknowledging the 8th would allow it to dock and release whatever waited inside. A car pulled up to the lighthouse as I finished my count. A young woman got out, maybe mid-20s, wearing a navy pea coat and carrying a leather messenger bag. She had the confident stride of someone who solved problems for a living, someone who believed rational thinking could handle any situation. Catherine Harrison, according to the documents she carried, here to settle her grandmother's estate. I watched from the beacon room as she found the rules taped to the kitchen counter, saw her read through them with growing amusement. She laughed, actually laughed, at the requirement to count exactly 7 boats, regardless of how many appeared. She was already heading outside to check the generator when I heard it fail, the familiar explosion that marked another keeper's first step toward understanding. Catherine stood in the yard, staring at the smoking remains of the backup power supply, her confident expression shifting to confusion. I picked up the oil lamp and headed downstairs to meet her. Somewhere in the lighthouse's temporal depths, I could feel Kayla and Samantha and my mother, all maintaining their own versions of this moment across different timelines. The cycle was beginning again, and I was no longer the student. I was the teacher.